The bleach hit the back of her throat first, sharp and clean and honest, the way very little else in the Voss Tower was. Ilse dragged the mop across the marble in long, deliberate arcs, the weight of the wet head pulling at her shoulders, the slap and drag of it swallowed by the cathedral silence of the 42nd floor at 11:15 on a Thursday night. The cleaning cart beside her was battered and squeaking on one wheel. She had requested a replacement 3 weeks ago and simply stopped waiting. That was the nature of being invisible. You learn to work around the broken things rather than expecting anyone to fix them. She wore what she always wore, a faded gray hoodie 2 sizes too large that skimmed the wide curve of her hips, navy drawstring trousers that pooled a little at her ankles, worn trainers that had been waterproofed with a spray can and sheer will. Her hair was pulled back so tightly it ached at the temples, which she preferred to feeling it loose against the sides of her face. Loose felt conspicuous. Conspicuous was dangerous. She had spent 7 years perfecting the art of taking up less space than her body physically allowed, and she was very good at it. She was not good, however, at being silent. The bucket wheel shrieked against the marble when she pivoted toward the east corridor, and that was the moment she realized she was not alone on the floor. The conference room at the end of the hall had its glass panels fogged with breath and low argument. She could see the shapes of men through the distortion. She could hear, now that she was paying attention, the low, controlled current of a voice that did not need volume to carry. She had heard that voice once before, from 40 feet away, on the lobby level, when it had told a security coordinator to resign. The coordinator had handed over his badge before the sentence finished. The conference room door was open 6 inches. Ilse pulled the cart slowly backward. Slowly. The wheel did not cooperate. The screech hit the air like a blade. Every shape inside the glass went still. She stopped breathing. The voice said, without inflection, without anger, as if commenting on the weather, "Bring her in." The cold that moved through her had nothing to do with the building's air system. Rafferty, the night supervisor, appeared in the corridor at a nearly running pace with an expression Ilse had never seen on his face before, which was the expression of a man understanding for the first time how small he was. He gestured at her with both hands. "Come, now." His mouth made the shapes without sound. She left the mop standing against the wall and walked toward the door, because there was no other direction that existed anymore. The conference room was all charcoal and shadow and the smell of cedar and something colder underneath it, something like gunmetal, something that did not belong to any ordinary Thursday night. 7 men sat at the long obsidian table. None of them looked at her. They were performing the careful act of not looking, which was its own kind of looking, and she knew the difference. She had been not looked at her entire life. Only one person in the room looked at her directly. He was sitting at the head of the table with both hands flat on the surface, as if the table were a landscape he owned. Dark hair, jaw that belonged on something carved rather than born. The suit was charcoal so deep it was almost black, and it sat on the breadth of his shoulders, the way architecture sits on good foundations. His eyes were the color of obsidian pulled from deep water, and they did not move off her face when she crossed the threshold, did not flick down to assess the hoodie or the drawstring trousers or the worn trainers, did not catalog and dismiss the way she had cataloged and dismissed herself for years. Caspian Voss looked at her face, only her face, and she, who had not been looked at in years, had absolutely no idea what to do with that. He said, "You've been cleaning this floor for how long?" It was not a question. She answered it anyway. 14 months. Something behind his eyes shifted. Not surprise, something slower than surprise and more deliberate. 14 months, he repeated, and the 2 words in his mouth sounded like an inventory he was conducting. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs through the fabric of her trousers and waited. He said, "You saw something last Tuesday, in the east corridor, near the server access panel. Her stomach dropped 3 floors. She had seen something. She had also, immediately and carefully and with absolute professional instinct, decided not to have seen it, to file it neatly into the compartment in her mind labeled, "None of your business, Ilsa," and get on with the grout cleaning. She had even scrubbed harder than usual, as if diligence could function as a kind of retroactive blindness. Caspian Voss was watching her face process all of this. "Yes," she said, because lying to those eyes seemed like a particular kind of stupidity. He held her gaze for 4 seconds. She counted. Then he said, "Sit down." The nearest chair was not near her. She crossed the room to it with every set of eyes performing their careful not looking. The chair was enormous and black and leather, and when she sat in it, she was aware of the full weight of her thighs spreading into the seat, the way her hips filled it wider than it was probably meant to be filled. She was always aware of these things. She adjusted nothing. She sat as she sat because there was nothing to be done about it, and because Caspian Voss was still looking only at her face, and that was confusing enough to occupy the part of her brain that usually handled self-inventory. He opened a folder on the table and slid it 6 inches toward her without looking at it. "Tell me what you saw." She looked at the documents inside the folder, and something happened to her breathing that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. Because she had a night job, and she had a day job, and her day job was forensic accounting at a small firm 3 blocks south of Voss Tower, and what she was looking at, spread across 5 pages of internal transfer records that Caspian Voss had clearly obtained through methods she would not be asking about, was the second half of a pattern she had accidentally noticed the first half of at 11:43 the previous Tuesday, when she'd been wiping down the server room corridor, and the door had been left fractionally open, and one screen inside had been displaying a cascade of account numbers that her brain had recognized and organized and memorized before she'd consciously decided to. She said, "This is a ledger falsification." The room changed temperature. He said, "Go on." She looked up. His face had not moved, but something in the quality of his stillness had deepened, the way very still water deepens when the bottom moves. "Whoever is doing this is good," she said. "They're running the discrepancy through 4 shell accounts and reversing the notation on the 3rd, which means it reads clean on any standard audit because the reconciliation looks like a timing issue, but it isn't. The sequence timestamps don't match the bank's own clearing window. The money is being extracted in the gap between the internal record and the external confirmation, which is about 11 minutes. Whoever set this up knew your audit cycle and set their extraction timing to sit inside it." No one in the room breathed. Caspian Voss said, very quietly, "How much?" She did the arithmetic in her head. She was very good at arithmetic. "Over 18 months, based on what I can see here, approximately 9.4 million. One of the men at the table made a sound. Caspian did not look at him. He looked at her. He said, "You saw all of this from a server room doorway." "I have a very retentive memory for numbers," she said, "and I'd already noticed a minor discrepancy in the lobby-level expense reports that didn't make sense. But I assumed it was just bad bookkeeping. When I saw the account strings on the screen, the pattern completed." He studied her face the way a cartographer studies a landscape, looking for everything it implied beyond what was visible. Then he said quietly, "What is your name?" "Ilsa," she said. "Ilsa Brandt." He repeated it once, under his breath, as if calibrating it for weight. She sat very still in the enormous leather chair and waited for whatever came next, and tried very hard not to think about how thoroughly she had just detonated the entire architecture of her invisibility. He did not thank her. She had not expected him to. He closed the folder and told the room that the meeting was over, and the men filed out with the careful, silent efficiency of people who understood that some things were beyond their clearance level, and then it was just her in the chair, and him standing at the window with his back to the room, and the city spread out below him like a map of everything he owned. She stood, reached for the back of the chair to steady herself. He said, without turning, "Don't come back to this floor tomorrow night." Her chest caved. "Mr. Voss, I need this job. I understand what I've seen, and I have absolutely no interest in discussing it with anyone. I promise you. I just need—" "You're not being let go." He turned then, and his face in the glass-reflected light of the city was shadowed on one side and lit on the other, and the contrast made something of his face that she could not look at for long without her pulse doing things it had no professional business doing. "You're being moved to the 44th floor. You'll be given access to the server room. I want you to find the rest of it." She opened her mouth, closed it. "I don't know what you think I am," she said carefully, "but I clean floors for a living." He looked at her with an expression she could not entirely name but which contained, underneath its absolute composure, something that might have been the very early precursor to amusement. "You also," he said, "hold a forensic accounting certification that lapsed 2 years ago due to non-payment of the renewal fee. The lapse was $43. The air left her body. She stared at him. He stared back. $43, she repeated. $43, he confirmed. And his voice had dropped one register, and it was the most obscene thing she'd experienced in a professional context, which she had no intention of telling him. He moved to the door and stopped with his hand on the frame. "The server room access card will be at the security desk at midnight. You'll have until 6 a.m. He glanced back once. "Brandt." "Yes?" "Stop pulling your sleeves down. You're in my building. Nothing here will hurt you." He walked out before she could process the fact that he had been watching closely enough to notice. She stood in the enormous empty conference room for 30 seconds after he was gone, her hands pressed flat against her thighs, her heart conducting itself like it had forgotten the agreed-upon tempo, and she thought that she had made a very serious mistake, and that it was probably not finding the embezzlement scheme, and that she was going to need to be considerably more careful about whatever happened next. She was not careful enough. 3 weeks later, she had mapped the entire extraction network, identified the source account owner, a man named Doran Kreis, head of internal compliance and the second longest tenured employee in Voss Tower, and cross-referenced the timing against Caspian's travel schedule in a way that revealed Kreis had been watching Caspian's patterns for 2 years before beginning the extraction. The scheme was elegant in the way that parasitic things are elegant. It needed a living host to survive. She had written none of this down. She had committed it entirely to memory and had been sleeping an average of 4 hours a night because the other hours were spent sitting at the small desk in her studio apartment, running figures in her head until they settled into certainty. Caspian had given her access to the server room and one encrypted tablet, and had spoken to her 3 times in those 3 weeks. Each conversation had lasted no more than 4 minutes. Each time he had listened to her findings without expression, asked 2 or 3 precise clarifying questions, and then said, "Continue." The word functioned simultaneously as a dismissal and a commission, and she had come to understand that was how he operated. Minimum syllables carrying maximum cargo. The 4th conversation lasted considerably longer. She found him already in the server room when she arrived at midnight on the 21st day, which had not happened before. He was standing with his back to the door and his jacket gone, sleeves rolled to the elbows, reading something on one of the wall-mounted monitors. The sight of his forearms, which she'd had no prior intelligence on, was information she immediately filed under "Do Not Engage with this, Ilsa." He said, without turning, "Kreis is planning to run." She stopped 2 feet inside the door. "How do you know?" "He transferred a personal asset this afternoon, a property in coastal Croatia. He's liquidating." He turned then, and there was something in his face that was different from the previous 3 conversations, something that had less composure in it and more pressure, something cold moving underneath the surface. "How much of this can you prove on paper?" she said. "All of it, except the source account. The shell chain terminates in a holding company registered in a jurisdiction that doesn't share banking records." His jaw set. "But," she said. He waited. "The extraction timing pattern is so specific to your audit cycle that anyone with access to your internal audit schedule would have had to be briefed on it directly. There are 6 people who receive that briefing. I can produce a comparative analysis of the communication logs from the encrypted tablet, showing which of those 6 had file access, on the dates corresponding to the account setup. It won't prove the money movement, but it will prove he knew about the window before anyone else did, and it will do it in a way that withstands external legal scrutiny." He looked at her for a long moment. "You've been building this," he said. "I've been building this." "For how long?" "Since the 2nd week." She paused. "I thought you might need something that could travel outside this building." Something moved across his face. She had learned, over 21 days, to watch for these movements the way you watch for weather in a place that rarely changes. This one was slower than the others, deeper. He said, very quietly, "Why?" She did not have a clean answer to that question. She had several complicated ones. She said, "Because whoever did this was hurting something that shouldn't be hurt." She looked at the monitor behind him. "You built this building. You built everything in it. It's yours." She paused again, aware she was in territory that had no professional roadmap. $43 is not enough to lose something real for. The server room was very quiet. He said, "The renewal fee." "I looked it up." She kept her voice level. "It was $43, and it lapsed in March 2 years ago. It was also 3 weeks after your previous chief of accounting resigned." She met his eyes. "I think you already know what I was doing in March 2 years ago." His expression held, and then something in it opened the way a room opens when someone finally unlocks it from the inside. He said, "Your mother." "Yes." Neither of them said anything else for several seconds. Then he said, "I want you in the meeting tomorrow night, not as a cleaner, as the analyst who built this case." Her stomach dropped in an entirely different direction than fear. Caspian. His name came out before she stopped it. She had never used it, not once. "Mr. Voss, I'm sorry." "My name," he said, with the deliberate weight of something chosen rather than corrected, "is Caspian. Use it." She pressed her palms against her thighs. He was already moving toward the door. He stopped with the same stillness he always stopped with, as if the pause were a decision rather than a hesitation. He said, without turning fully toward her, "What you've built is extraordinary, Ilsa." She said nothing. He turned just enough to catch the edge of her expression in his peripheral line and said, "I know you don't believe that yet." He left before she could answer, and she stood in the server room with the monitors casting their pale blue light across the gray of her hoodie and thought that she was in a great deal of trouble, and none of it had anything to do with Doran Kreis. The meeting the following night was in the same conference room, the same obsidian table, the same men arranged with their careful not looking. She was wearing the same gray hoodie because she had not expected to be told to attend, and she had come in her work clothes, and she was acutely, viscerally aware of the fact that she was the softest thing in a room built entirely for hard angles. And then Doran Kreis walked in. He was 61, silver-haired, the kind of man whose face had settled into an expression of genial authority over decades of practice. He sat at Caspian's right hand. He looked at Caspian. He looked at the other men. He looked at the documents on the table. And then his eyes moved to Ilsa and stopped. She watched something behind them compute. She watched the computation reach its conclusion. He said, "What is she doing here?" Not to anyone in particular, to the room. Caspian said, "She's the analyst who found your work." Christ looked at Ilse with an expression that was calibrated to destroy. It was very practiced. She had seen expressions like this her whole life, had spent years growing scar tissue over the places they usually landed. He said, "She's a cleaning woman." The room temperature dropped. Caspian said, "Yes," a single syllable. Absolute and final. The word said, "You have just made an error of classification that you will not be given the opportunity to correct." Christ tried to recalibrate. "I mean only that her position here would make her reliability as a Ilse." Caspian's voice came from a very still place. He did not look away from Christ when he said her name. "Yes. Walk them through the account structure. Start with the shell company registered in February 18 months ago." She opened the encrypted tablet. Her hands were completely steady. She did not know where the steadiness came from, possibly from the fact that Caspian had said her name across a room full of men as if it were a flag being planted. She walked them through it. She was 10 minutes into the presentation when Christ tried to interrupt. She did not stop. She spoke over him without raising her voice, laying each piece of the financial architecture in sequence, and she watched his color change as the case assembled itself around him like a structure with no exits. At the 14-minute mark, she presented the communication log analysis. At 17 minutes, she laid the comparative timestamp evidence. At 19 minutes, she sat down. The room was very quiet. Christ said tightly, "This is circumstantial." "The holding company," Caspian said, still with no particular emphasis, "is registered to an address in Split, Croatia, which is 40 minutes from the coastal property you liquidated yesterday." He tilted his head a fraction. "The property you purchased in 2019 under your wife's maiden name." The color drained out of Christ's face completely. Caspian said, "The documentation leaves this building tomorrow morning. It goes to 3 destinations simultaneously: the Financial Crimes Unit, my attorneys, and a secured server that releases automatically if any of the 3 copies are interfered with." He looked at Christ the way you look at something you have already finished with. That last part was Ilse's design. Christ looked at her. She held his gaze and thought of all the times she had folded herself small and backed out of rooms and convinced herself that not being seen was the same as being safe. She thought of her mother. March, 2 years ago, $43. She did not fold. Christ was removed from the building with a quietness that she suspected was not the quietness of mercy, but the quietness of a much more considered resolution. 2 of Caspian's men accompanied him into the elevator. The doors closed. No one spoke. Then the other men filed out, and then it was just her and Caspian and the obsidian table and the city outside the glass. He stood at the window again. She waited in the chair, the enormous leather chair, and she was aware of herself in it the way she was always aware of herself in chairs that had not been built expecting her. The way her hips filled the seat and her thighs pressed against the arms, and the whole geography of her weight made itself known to her in the detailed and unkind way that her body announced itself when she had nothing else to focus on. She was tired. She had been tired for 3 weeks, tired in the specific way of someone who has been very alert for a very long time. Caspian said, without turning, "You never told anyone what you saw. For 3 weeks, you could have." "I know. You could have gone to the Financial Crimes Unit directly, without involving me. I know that too. Why didn't you?" She looked at her hands on the table. The tablet was between them, powered down now, its job complete. "Because it was yours," she said. "The scheme was designed around you specifically. Whoever resolved it needed to be you." He turned from the window. She looked up and found him already crossing the room toward her. Not quickly, but with the kind of deliberateness that didn't require speed, and he stopped at the end of the table 2 feet from where she sat, and looked at her with an expression she had no existing vocabulary for. It was too much and too controlled at the same time. and it made her feel that the room had become smaller around them. He said, "Stand up." She stood up. He moved around the end of the table until he was in front of her, and she was aware of the fact that he was very large in a way that she was usually not allowed to be aware of, that his shoulders took up a particular amount of the available air, that the cedar and cold metal smell of him was very close now. He lifted one hand and she went absolutely still, and he put 2 fingers beneath her chin and tilted her face up to meet his. "You've been hiding," he said. She said, "I'm not hiding." "You've been hiding in that hoodie and those trousers and the hair pulled back until it damages the skin at your temples." His thumb moved, barely, against the line of her jaw, and she stopped breathing with a great deal of professionalism. "You've been standing in corners and moving at the edges of rooms and making yourself small enough to fit through spaces that were not built for you." She said, "I clean floors. There isn't a lot of call for. Ilsa." She stopped. He said, very quietly, close enough that the words traveled without needing volume, "You walked into a room full of men who have killed people, and you laid out a case that a senior financial investigator would have taken 6 months to build. You didn't flinch. You didn't apologize. You didn't fold." His eyes, which were the color of very deep water, moved over her face with the slow deliberateness of someone reading something they intend to remember precisely. "And then you sat back down in that chair the way you always sit in chairs that aren't built for you, like you owe the furniture an apology for existing." She felt her throat close. "You do not," he said, with the same quiet completeness he used for business orders, "owe anything an apology. Not a chair, not a room, not anyone in it." She said, "Caspian," his name again. It kept happening. "The certification renewal," he said. "The $43, it's been handled. Your certification is active as of this morning." She stared at him. "You also," he said, "are no longer a night cleaner. You're my forensic analyst. Your office is on this floor. The salary will reflect what you're actually worth, which is not what you've been paid." Something in his expression shifted, and the shift was the most naked thing she had seen on his face. "I should have known who you were 14 months ago," she said. "I didn't want to be known." "I know." He did not move back. "I'm asking you to want it now." The city sprawled beyond the glass, 42 floors of it, all its cold light and moving dark, and Ilsa Brandt stood in the charcoal conference room of Voss Tower in her faded gray hoodie and her navy drawstring trousers and her spray can waterproof trainers, and she let herself be looked at. She let the full weight of his attention fall on her without folding under it, and she thought that this was the most terrifying thing she had ever done, including everything she had done in the last 3 weeks, including the part where she had put 3 simultaneous documents on 3 servers as a dead man's switch against a man who could have had her removed from the building, and from a great deal more besides. He said, "There's something I need to tell you." She waited. "You were not the only one hiding." He said it with such complete calm that it took a moment to understand what he'd said. "I saw you, the first week you were on this floor. I came back to the office at 1 in the morning, and you were cleaning the east corridor, and you had a textbook propped on the cart, and you were reading it while you mopped." Something crossed his face that she thought might be the closest he got to self-reproach. "I told myself it wasn't my business." She said nothing. "And then," he said, "every time after that, I had the 11:45 meetings on this floor scheduled so that I had a reason to still be in the building." The silence in the room was the kind that forms when something that has been held very still for a very long time is finally released. She said, "You're telling me you've been conducting business meetings at midnight because you wanted to be in the same building as the woman cleaning your floors." He held her gaze. "Yes," she said, very carefully. "That is insane." He said, with the absolute deadpan she had heard him use exactly once before, on the subject of her $43. It's possible I operate better with a specific kind of incentive. She looked at him. He looked at her. The city moved behind the glass. The fluorescent overheads hummed. Her cleaning cart was still parked in the east corridor with one bad wheel, and somewhere below them, Doran Kreis was contemplating a future that did not include Croatia. And Caspian Voss, who wore charcoal suits that cost more than her monthly rent and spoke in a voice that caused rooms to rearrange themselves around him, was standing in front of her, with his thumb still barely touching her jaw, looking at her with the focused intensity of a man who has decided something and is not the kind of man whose decisions are reversible. She said, "I'm going to need the chair, the one at the security desk. It's already there, and the access card. Your biometrics are already in the system." She looked up at him. "You were very confident." "No," he said, and it was the first time she'd heard anything in his voice that wasn't confidence. "I was hopeful. There's a difference." She reached up and covered the hand at her jaw with her own, and his breath caught, just slightly, just enough for her to hear it, and she thought, this is what it is to take up the right amount of space. Not less, not apologetically, exactly as much as she was. "Caspian," she said. "Yes. The $43. Yes. I'm going to pay you back." He said, "You already have," and he said it in the low, rough register that her professional judgment had no power over whatsoever, and she stopped having thoughts about professional judgment almost immediately after that. The east corridor glowed faintly through the conference room glass, the fluorescent utility lights of her old world bleeding through toward the low amber warmth of the space they stood in, and Ilse Brandt, who had spent 7 years learning the particular discipline of being overlooked, discovered that being seen by the right person felt nothing like exposure. It felt like arriving. If Caspian and Ilse's story got under your skin, hit that like button. It tells us you want more stories like this one. Share this with someone who needs a good slow burn tonight, and subscribe so you never miss when we drop a new story on this channel. And tell us in the comments, did you see the dead man's switch coming? Or did Ilse surprise you? We read every single one.